"Excuse me, ma'am. This area is for the official party and distinguished guests," the officer said, his voice slick with the kind of courtesy that carries the weight of insult. And Captain Ryan Keller looked up just long enough to register the polished brass of his nameplate, the rigid line of his jaw, and the faint gleam of disdain hiding behind the polite smile that had dismissed 100 people like her before breakfast. She didn't argue. She never did. She simply nodded once, stepped aside, and let him usher her toward the back of the hall, away from the rows of medals, pressed uniforms, and political smiles that filled the front section of the grand ballroom. The air smelled of cologne and starch, heavy with the ceremonial pomp that military culture wore like armor, the kind that made people forget the sound of real gunfire. Ryan moved quietly through the crowd, her black uniform crisp but unadorned except for a single ribbon bar that caught the light for a moment before vanishing in the sea of brass. Around her, laughter and chatter mixed with the hum of an orchestra rehearsing patriotic tunes. No one looked twice. They never did. That anonymity was a shield, one she'd worn for years. And she'd learned to let people assume, about her rank, her record, her worth, because the truth had no need for announcement. She found an empty seat near the side, where the shadows from the stage curtains fell across the polished floor. From here she could see everything. The rows of generals seated like kings, the politicians murmuring to aides, the photographers crouched with cameras ready to capture what they thought history looked like. A woman beside her whispered something to her husband, eyes flicking toward Ryan's plain uniform. "Probably logistics," the husband replied with a grin. Ryan pretended not to hear. Her hands rested loosely on her lap, steady, calloused, and still bearing the faint scars of years spent in places that didn't exist on maps. Afghanistan, Syria, Yemen, names that had long since blurred into dust and echoes. Her mind wasn't in the ballroom. It was in the silence before a breach. The rhythmic hum of rotor blades in the dark, the sting of sand on skin, the weight of decisions that never left her even when the uniforms were hung up and the medals locked away. The ceremony began with the usual speeches. Words like courage, sacrifice, and honor filled the air, rehearsed phrases spoken by men who hadn't stood in the rain waiting for a medevac that never came. She watched without expression, her mind drifting. The general on stage talked about legacy and tradition, his voice rising to applause that came too easily. The room glowed with self-congratulation, but beneath it all there was something else, a quiet fatigue that clung to the few who actually knew what those words cost. Ryan's gaze drifted to a row near the front where the decorated officers sat, ribbons gleaming under the chandelier light. She recognized faces from briefings and operations, men who had issued orders from behind walls while others carried them out in streets filled with fire. Some of them had once known her name. Most had forgotten. When the announcer finally reached the commendations, the atmosphere shifted. The crowd straightened in their seats, photographers poised. "For distinguished service and acts of valor in the line of duty," the voice boomed, reading from the teleprompter. Names rolled off the tongue in polished rhythm, each followed by applause. Then came the pause. The announcer cleared his throat. "Captain Ryan Keller, United States Army Special Operations Command, recipient of the Silver Star and Distinguished Service Cross." The silence that followed was almost tangible. Heads turned. The same officer who had told her to move earlier blinked, confusion spreading across his face as if the words refused to fit the image before him. Slowly Ryan stood. The faint rustle of her uniform was the only sound as she walked toward the stage. Every step echoed through the hall, cutting through the polished veneer of the evening. The whispers began, soft, uncertain, like wind shifting direction. The announcer handed her the medal box with careful formality. The commanding general stepped forward to pin it on her chest himself. "You've done more for this flag than most of us combined," he murmured. Ryan met his eyes briefly. "Just did my job, sir." The general smiled, but there was something solemn in his gaze, a recognition that real service rarely came with witnesses. The applause swelled, polite but hesitant, as if the crowd was still adjusting to the idea that the quiet woman they had dismissed minutes ago was the reason several operations in 2 different countries had succeeded. She returned to her seat, passing the lieutenant who had tried to block her earlier. He half rose, his mouth opening with some attempt at apology, but she stopped him with a single glance. "Don't worry, Lieutenant," she said softly, her voice calm as still water. "Mistakes happen. The ceremony continued, but the energy had shifted. People glanced at her now, some out of guilt, others curiosity. A reporter snapped a photo, then lowered the camera with a faint, almost respectful nod. Ryan ignored them all. Her mind had already drifted to another place entirely. The desert night when her team had gone silent over the radio. The long minutes before she knew who had made it back. She remembered the sound of footsteps crunching over gravel as she searched for survivors, the low hum of a drone circling above, the sharp metallic scent of gunpowder and blood. Those memories never faded. They simply folded themselves into the rhythm of her breathing, resurfacing in quiet moments like this when the noise of ceremony dulled. After the final salute and the closing march, the crowd spilled into the reception hall. Champagne glasses clinked, laughter returned, and the orchestra played a softer tune. Ryan slipped out onto the balcony overlooking the city. The air was cool, the night sharp with the scent of rain. Down below, headlights traced lines through the streets, a reminder that the world moved on, indifferent to medals and ceremonies. She leaned on the railing, the metal cold beneath her palms. Behind her, footsteps approached. It was the lieutenant again, now without the arrogance, his cap tucked under one arm. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "I just wanted to say, I didn't know who you were." Ryan turned slightly, her expression unreadable. "You don't need to know who someone is to treat them with respect," she replied, her voice soft but final. The young man nodded, his face pale with shame, and walked away without another word. Left alone, Ryan stared at the horizon. The city lights flickered like distant fires. Her reflection in the glass looked older than she felt, lines at the corners of her eyes, a faint scar tracing her temple. She thought about the people who weren't here tonight, the ones who'd never receive medals, whose stories would never be told. She thought of Daniels, who'd saved her life outside Kandahar and laughed about it later as if it were nothing. Of Torres, who'd lost half his platoon and still volunteered for another tour. Of Ellis, whose last transmission had been a joke about bad coffee. Their faces came and went like ghosts in the reflection. Ryan closed her eyes, whispering their names under her breath. A silent roll call that no ceremony would ever acknowledge. When she finally turned to leave, a small crowd was gathered inside, watching her with a mix of awe and guilt. The general caught her eye, offered a nod of genuine respect. Ryan returned it briefly before walking past them, through the glittering hall, out the double doors, and into the cool night air. The street outside was empty except for a single cab idling at the curb. She climbed in, gave an address, and sat back as the city blurred past. The metal in her pocket felt heavy, not because of its weight, but because of what it represented. Every commendation was a reminder of something lost, a debt that could never truly be repaid. She ran her thumb along the engraved edge, feeling the grooves of her own history. The cab dropped her at a small apartment building on the edge of town, far from the grandeur of the city center. Inside, the lights were dim, the space sparse, photos on a single shelf, each one a fragment of a life lived between deployments. Her father in uniform long before she was born, her team on a dusty airstrip grinning through exhaustion, a folded flag in a frame. She hung her jacket on the hook by the door and poured a glass of water, staring at the faint shimmer of the metal on the counter. Outside, thunder rolled in the distance. She thought of the lieutenant again, his voice uncertain, his eyes wide. Maybe he'd learned something tonight. Maybe not. But the moment would linger, the realization that the quiet ones often carried the heaviest stories. Ryan sat by the window, the rain beginning to fall against the glass, and let the memories come. The ambush outside Mosul, the deafening silence of a radio that should have been alive with voices, the helicopter that never arrived. She remembered crawling through the rubble to reach a wounded soldier, her hands slick with blood, her ears ringing from the blast. She remembered the weight of his body when she dragged him to cover, the final exhale that told her she was too late. Those were the moments that defined her, not the medals, not the ceremonies. Just the choices made in the dark when no one was watching. Hours passed. The city quieted. In the stillness, Ryan took the medal and placed it beside the others in a small wooden box, closing the lid with a soft click. She whispered a name, Daniels, and then another, Torres, and felt something unclench inside her chest. Tomorrow she would go back to base, back to the endless cycle of briefings and reports. But tonight she allowed herself this silence, this fragile peace. The world outside didn't know her story, and she preferred it that way. There was power in being underestimated, in letting the noise pass while she waited for the right moment to act. That had always been her strength, not the loudness of command, but the steadiness of purpose. When dawn broke, pale and uncertain, Ryan stood at the window watching the first light touch the rooftops. The rain had stopped. The air smelled of renewal. Somewhere, a radio played the morning news, mentioning the ceremony, listing the names of heroes. She turned it off. She didn't need to hear it. She'd lived enough to know that real honor didn't need witnesses. She picked up her cap, straightened her jacket, and stepped outside. The street was empty, the city waking slowly. As she walked, her reflection moved in the puddles, quiet, composed, unremarkable to anyone passing by. And that was fine. She didn't need them to see the soldier beneath the silence. She carried that truth with her, invisible but unbreakable, a living testament to the kind of strength the world often overlooks. And somewhere deep down, she smiled, not the kind born of pride, but the quiet satisfaction of knowing that she had nothing left to prove.